This is week 3 of Jihad. Today we're going to talk about the Russians in Afghanistan. And this really begins to set the pace for the so-called jihadi movements. But first we're going to talk a little bit about Russian foreign policy. It's pretty good to have, it's pretty nice to have a background here before we really get into Afghanistan. And the Russians had been in Afghanistan on and off for quite a number of years. Of course, keep in mind one thing. The British tried to tame this area in the 19th century, going into the 20th, and they really will not be able to do it. The typical Afghan rebellion, backlash, upheaval, whatever you want to call it, these tribesmen worked very hard to throw out people they considered invaders or colonial interlopers, however way you want to frame this. You go back to 1828, on and off through the 19th century. In fact, in the late 1830s, when the British had like 16,000 people in Kabul, they decided they were going to pull these people out of 16,000 plus, over 4,000 were British soldiers, and they made that trek from Kabul to what was colonial India at the time, and out of 16,000 plus, only one made it. Shows you how much these people didn't like the British being there. And that included men, women, children. Well, it made no difference. They don't want you there, get out. Simple. That's how sometimes these people can be. And I might have brought it up before, you know, when the Russians invaded in '79, which we'll talk a little bit about, they accidentally, in 1980, 81, they accidentally bombed a school and killed 60 kids. And these people don't forget these slights, and 2 busloads of Afghan communists, collaborators, if you want to call them that, or quislings, if you remember the World War II term for traitor. They stopped these buses and took everyone off and separated the parents from their children, and then slit all the throats of the kids. These people, some of these people, these tribesmen, it's 1 + 1 is 2, and we do not need a convoluted mathematical formula that would take up that whole back wall there to get to the result. 1 + 1 is 2. It's easy to, and even American reporters said, why? And one of the jihadis said, one of the guerrillas said, Mujahideen, which means soldier of God, said, better to kill him now than have to fight him later on. Very, very simple mindset here. Very, very simple. Not hard to fathom here. But anyway, yeah, you go, and these people, again, these people are very, very adverse to be ruled colonially. They've had this history for years. And what's fascinating here, you're going to get this before we're done here, how basically it's the same basic defense posture. Use the terrain, which is very mountainous, and use these tribal connections to defeat the invader. And you go back to the 19th century, then compare the Russians. The Russians are very, very technologically advanced. That seemed to make no difference in the end. Sure, the cost to the Afghans goes up. And you'll see that. In fact, you can see on that handout I gave you, if you go to page 2 or 3, the cost to both sides. But it made no difference. They helped throw the Russians out. And of course, yes, did the CIA arm these people with some modern weapons? Of course they did. And we'll get into that a little bit too. But in the end, it's going to be these tribal people that are going to throw the Russians out in a 9+ year conflict, getting the Russians stuck in these mountains. And we'll get into that. But however, let's go back to the First World War. I mentioned before, we can't seem to get away from this conflict. And with the collapse of these monarchs, you will see the Bolsheviks are going to take over Russia. The Romanovs are going to be gone. The Bolsheviks take over. Well, the Amir in Afghanistan, Amir Amanullah Khan, takes this example of the Soviets and wants to place it here in Afghanistan. Modernize Afghanistan. And he's going to contact Lenin, and the Russians are going to set up shop here in Afghanistan. Not anything out of the ordinary here, but they're going to set up shop here. Well, the British don't like that, because Amanullah Khan actually threw the British out after the Third British Anglo-Afghan War. By 1919, the British are out. One of their few failures here really to speak of. But having said that, the Russians are going to set up shop, and the British are very much aware of this. Why? Colonial India is next door. Can't have the Russians setting up shop in Afghanistan, and there's also the Persia next door to the west. Can't have the Russians setting up shop here. And they're actually going to, Amanullah Khan is going to be deposed from power in 1928. And there's going to be one man in this British contingent that's going to help put out Amanullah Khan. Keep in mind, the British here are supporting the Muslim tribesmen here to throw the Russians out and to get rid of Amanullah Khan. And one of the men involved in this effort is known by a pseudonym named Airman Shaw. Interesting what his real name was, T.E. Lawrence. That man got around. Of course, he'll die, 7 years later in a motorcycle crash. If you remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia, that's how the movie starts. But it's interesting how the West versus the Soviets in foreign policy in the 1920s. And actually, if I'm not incorrect here, I think in 1921, when the Soviets signed on an accord with Afghanistan, this was really the first real recognition of the Soviet state by somebody from the outside world, and that was Afghanistan. But if you go through the 30s, you go through the 40s, the Second World War, Afghanistan is more or less a backwater here. And what's going to happen though in the 40s, going into the 50s, this is where it starts. And the Russians are going to try to set up a deeper presence here in Afghanistan. 1953, a Prince Mohammed Daoud will take power here. And he wants to do the same thing Amanullah Khan wanted to do. Modernize Afghanistan. And it's interesting here because he's going to allow the Soviets to come in. And the Soviets are going to try to improve the infrastructure. Now keep in mind here, Afghanistan was not noted for its super highways. I mean, this is a real backwater here. And what's going to happen here is the Russians are going to come in and build some roads, some highways. Interesting, 1953, 54, 55, 56, and they're even going to build the Salang Tunnel through the mountains. But it's interesting here, as they're building this infrastructure of roads, guess what's going to happen here? This is the same series of roads the Russians are going to use in 1979 to invade this country. That's interesting. Talk about planning for the future. That's a fascinating concept. Build the roads, and then 26 years, 28 years later, use them to invade the neighbor. Fascinating concept here. Absolutely fascinating. But still, there is no real mass infrastructure of roadways here in Afghanistan. It's highly mountainous. And the United States and the UN forces are going to run into the same problem in Korea. Now that's fascinating. What massive infrastructure of roadways exist in Korea in 1950? You don't have it. And yet what's interesting here is, again, the Russians are going to make the same mistake here. Heavily mechanized armed forces. All right? And they're going to be pushed back by the North Koreans. You know, this is the start of the Korean Civil War, June 25, 1950, which is essentially what this was, a civil war. And it's going to draw the Chinese, it's going to draw in the UN, the United States, Britain, so on and so forth. I'm sure you know how that went. But the fact of the matter is, without this massive infrastructure of roadways, how's a mechanized UN army supposed to move quickly?
Train.
Well, you know, what's fascinating here is when they push the North Koreans out of South Korea and they begin the quest toward the Yalu, what is China doing? Do not come near the Yalu. Do not come near the Yalu. Do not come near the Yalu. They warned Washington and the Allies more than once. And what's going to happen? Thanksgiving Day, 1950, 300,000 Chinese. But the fascinating aspect here is the UN forces are consigned to the few roads available, and all of these trucks and tanks and armored vehicles trying to go down the few roads available are being pushed back by guys on foot. The Chinese control the countryside. they're used to fighting against Chiang Kai-shek's army and the Japanese in the Chinese Civil War. They were mechanized, they fought on foot, which means maneuver warfare on foot, man's oldest way of moving, and it worked. That's what the Chinese army was trained on. So now they come out of a guerrilla setting and go to a conventional setting, and it works here. Why? Because there's steel roads. And even the massive Allied bombing of these Chinese hordes does not stop the Chinese, which goes back to one of our presidential candidates who not long ago was to ask what he would do about the problem in Iraq. What did he say? Carpet bomb them? Go back in history. Does it work all the time? No. Apparently not. Apparently not. Kind of calls into question what kind of a commander-in-chief you're going to have if he gets elected. Even General Horner of the United States Air Force more or less said, in polite language, of course, he's got to be kidding. Now, anyone remember Vietnam here? Remember Nixon's bombing of the North Vietnamese? Did we win that war? No. Go back to that cover sheet here on this handout. And what do you see? It's fascinating. Harry Summers is the first quote here. And this is tailor-made for this. You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield, said the American colonel. The North Vietnamese colonel pondered this remark a moment. That may be so, he replied, but it is also irrelevant. Now, Colonel Harry Summers is interesting because Colonel Harry Summers was in Vietnam, but he was also picked to be part of the legation at Henry Kissinger when he went to Paris. And he met this colonel, and this is where this conversation transpires. And he puts it in his book on strategy. And now, fast forward many years down the road, and what do you see? It's the same sort of message here. No Soviet garrison or major outpost was ever overrun. Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, the last Soviet commander of the 40th Army. This comes from an unclassified CIA report. But that makes no difference. The Soviets getting out? Yeah, they are by 1989. Interesting. These underfed, ill-clad, ill-armed people of the mountains or the bush throw out superpowers. That's an interesting scenario. It really is. And here's the third one, which is, I think, it tells everything you need to know about the Russian debacle in Afghanistan. When asked what made him, the Mujahideen, successful, Commander Belloc said, "We intended to fight to the last man, and they didn't." And then there's Ayatollah Khomeini in March 1980. The danger of communist powers is not less than that of America. You get that message? Interesting. I hope the Muslim people of Afghanistan, now he makes no differentiation here. Sunni, Shia, the Muslim people. I hope the Muslim people of Afghanistan will soon achieve victory and real independence and get rid of those so-called supporters of the working class. His idea of this so-called quest by United States democracy or the Russians with their proletarian revolution doesn't apply here. Doesn't apply. You see where this is going here? So you see in the 1950s when the Russians come in and they begin to put this infrastructure of roadways. Those are the same roads they're going to use in '79 to invade this place, Afghanistan. However, what's interesting here is what goes on back and forth in government in Kabul. You know, Daoud is going to be ousted in 1963, and the monarch, Tahir Shah will take over. But he's going to be out in 1973 with another coup by Prince Mohammed Daoud. He's again going to try to modernize this nation. At the same time, he had support of the Communist Party, which was the People's Democratic Party of Iraq, of Afghanistan. But they have a problem. They have two factions. The Khalq faction, or the Masses faction, and Parcham, or the Banner faction. Now, the Khalq faction is interesting. They have a more draconian approach of taking power. Almost like the old Marxist type, the doctrinaire Marxist version you'll find in the Communist Manifesto. The violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie and a proletarian dictatorship until the bourgeoisie is done. Of course, what kind of bourgeoisie do you have in Afghanistan? As opposed opposed to the banner approach or the Parcham approach, which is Babrak Karmal, who will later take over as the prime minister or the leader for the Russians. They want to assimilate the country, more or less peacefully, almost like real socialists. Real socialists do not want a violent approach to taking power. They want to assimilate everybody. But the Kalk faction has more support in the army. And in 1978, they're going to launch an overthrow here. And Daoud will be shot, and Nur Mohammed Taraki and Hafizullah Amin will take over. Now, you are going to see here a backlash, well, you were seeing a backlash build up here anyway, among the tribesmen. Well, what do they think the Popular Democratic Party of Afghanistan is? It's a Russian lackey. And what are the communists? Infidels. Can't have them. So now you're beginning to see this backlash begin to build among these tribesmen. Now again, if you take a look at one of those, I think it's the second map in that handout, you will see this patchwork quilt which makes up Afghanistan. It's fascinating to see all these different ethnicities involved in Afghanistan. The Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Nuristanis, the Baluchis, the Pashtuns, who make up almost 50% of the country. And that's another issue. The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the old Darien line, which was consummated in 1893. Before you had a Pakistan, it was colonial India. Now, many of these people do not recognize this border. They're floating back and forth all the time. What border? Again, you see here what the British have done, drawing this demarcation line between the Pashtun tribesmen, almost the same sort of situation you see in Iraq. Drawing borders through, a European-style settlement being drawn through clannish associations, tribal affiliations, religious differences, and ethnic passions. And again, you don't think you're not going to have a problem here? And especially that western side of what was colonial India, which is now Pakistan, the northwest frontier territories with inside areas, the federally administered tribal areas. Pakistan, Islamabad can't control this area. The British couldn't control this area. It is a hotbed of drug trafficking, arms smuggling, people smuggling, tribes going back and forth. How are you supposed to control it? You're not going to. You are not going to. And this area will be loaded up with refugees when the Russians march in. Estimates range at one point anywhere from 4 to 5 million Afghans were refugees here, going to either Pakistan or Iran, most going to Pakistan. And there were maybe 1.5 million to 2 million internally displaced. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Of course, this is tailor-made for those so-called schools known as the madrasas. These religious schools, keep in mind, this war produced a lot of orphans. Kids 7, 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, 14 years old, their parents are killed. They're in these refugee camps. Well, what do you think is going to happen to them? Some of them are going to wind up in these madrasas. You get a kid going into these madrasas at 8 years old in 1982, 1983. By the time the war is over, he comes out, he's what? 13 years old, 14 years old? How do you think he's going to be? This is almost like a recruiting ground for future jihadis. And if you're thinking along those lines, you're not that far off the track here. You're really not. But having said that, when the Russians march in here, they're going to get rid of Hafizullah. Well, Hafizullah Amin is going to be killed here by Taraki. It's interesting that Mohammed Taraki's way of trying to implement socialism in Afghanistan, there's an intense backlash by these tribesmen. And he had exiled Hafizullah Amin outside the country. Well, on his way back to Afghanistan, he stops in Moscow. And when he gets to Afghanistan, what do you think Taraki's thinking? Maybe a potential coup, so he has him killed. So now the Russians understand there's only one way to go here. One way to go. And they're going to invade Afghanistan. Now keep in mind, too, what's interesting here is General Ibashev goes there in April 1979. He is a general in the Soviet Army, head of the political directorate. He goes there with an entourage and assesses the situation in Afghanistan. He's going to be followed in August by a General Ivan Pavlovsky, who is Commander-in-Chief of Soviet ground forces. Well, that's not a good sign when he shows up in your doorstep. And he's going to go there with another entourage, and they're going to reconnoiter Afghanistan. Keep in mind, what's interesting here is General Ibyshev was also the one who did the reconnaissance in Czechoslovakia in 1968 before the Soviets marched in. And General Pavlovsky is the one who led the Soviet troops in the Czechoslovakia in 1968. You think this is an accident here? I don't think so. What's interesting here is this Soviet penchant toward using the Red Army when they think it's necessary to keep this idea of socialism or these socialist regimes going. You know, if you go back to Hungary in 1956, the Soviets lost 669 dead in subduing the Hungarian Revolution. They're only going to lose they're going to lose less than 100 dead in Czechoslovakia. So the lessons they learned in Hungary, they applied to Czechoslovakia. Hopefully, these lessons will pan out in Afghanistan. Now keep in mind here for the Soviets in the 1970s, how they see the world. And they see the world changing. Now, the world's always in flux anyway. You know, what's going to happen in Vietnam? Isn't the United States going to lose here? Yeah. What's going to happen with in 1978 in Iran? The revolution? The Shah's going to be out. So what was seemingly set in stone here is now falling apart. Same thing can be said in the Middle East. Didn't Sadat lose the 73 war with Israel? Yeah, he did. So what is he going to do? At long last, Egypt is going to dump the Russians, and they're going to go where the money is, the United States. What's going to follow 5 years after the defeat at the hands of the Israelis? Camp David Accords? Somalia is eventually going to dump the Russians. So is Eritrea. Things aren't looking quite as rosy here, folks. Things aren't looking quite as rosy. And if you understand what's going on in Africa, remember Angola, all those Cuban troops in Angola? They were really Russian proxies. That's what they were. In Kampuchea or Cambodia, remember when the Vietnamese army sent 200,000 men into Cambodia to get rid of the Khmer Rouge? That's interesting too, because the Soviets support the Vietnamese. Who supported the Khmer Rouge? China. Yep, China. And at the same time, prior even to that, after the United States is losing in Vietnam, what does Nixon do with China? Opens up relations with them? How do you think the Soviets see the globe at this point? They almost have no choice but to go into Afghanistan and make sure they don't lose it. So Soviet Special Forces and Airborne troops will go in. Christmas Eve, 1979. And Nur Mohammad Taraki is not going to be along for this world. They will take him out. And Babrak Karmal will be the new Soviet lackey. Because he's seen as sort of, he has the softer approach, trying to assimilate the people. Many of these tribesmen don't want to be assimilated. They do not want to be assimilated. Herein lies the beginning of the war. This war will go on for 9+ years. The Soviets, what they're going to do is occupy the cities or positions of strategic significance. The countryside will remain in control of the guerrillas. Now, what's fascinating here is Viktor Brzezinski is the one who coined the phrase with the Carter administration that we are going to get the Russians stuck in their Vietnam. Remember that one? They are going to get stuck in their Vietnam. Yes and no. You can't just say this is another Vietnam. There's a plethora of differences here. When we went into Vietnam, and what's interesting here too, we went into Vietnam and at top end, we're eventually going to have 562,000 troops here. 562,000 troops. That's a lot of men. In a country that's 1/5 the size of Afghanistan. And yet the Russians at top end are only going to commit about 104,000 men to Afghanistan. in a country 5 times as large as Vietnam, and yet commit maybe 1/5 what we committed into Vietnam. It's interesting. Interesting. But Vietnam, the United States, sure, was fighting an insurgency. Guerrillas. Viet Cong, remember them? Sure. They were controlled by who? Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap in Hanoi. Eventually, as the war goes on, if you remember my Vietnam Long War series, eventually the North Vietnamese are going to assert more and more and more and more men as the VC morale begins to flag here. 1968, 69, 70 after the Tet Offensive. But the fact of the matter is, it's basically one enemy with one real leader. Afghanistan is not this way. Again, take a look at that map of those varying ethnicities here. And there's also the issue of religion. You didn't really have that baggage in Vietnam. You didn't have that baggage. Oh yeah, you had the Buddhists and so on and so forth. But that wasn't the real issue here. It was political, not religious. Of course, when you get into Afghanistan, it's not only political, it's ethnic. There's ethnicities and there's religion. You remember what I said last week when Saeed Qutb once said, the real nationality for Muslims is its religion. Does that cross borders? Yes. Fascinating concept, that. Fascinating concept, that. And that has resonated with today's jihadis. And even those a few years ago, Osama bin Laden, I was just listening to Seymour Hersh this morning talking about the death of bin Laden. Interesting. Interesting. Fascinating. But the fact of the matter is here, the Russians are faced with a situation completely different than Vietnam. Yes, it's an insurgency, and yes, they're going to be stuck in a quagmire. But what's fascinating here is, you go into these different areas of the country, the Hazaras, for instance, who, if someone remember how I mentioned, at one point rode with Genghis Khan centuries ago. They're Shias. But when you go in here, you're fighting a mujahideen. In other words, soldiers of God, these so-called guerrillas. And yet, go into the Tajik enclave. Now, you're fighting Sunnis. Still a mujahideen, but now you're fighting Sunnis. Go into the Pashtuns. Sunnis again. But again, it's all over the lot. And there's a loose confederation, but there's not one leader that you can kill and end the insurgency. There's like 10, 12 different insurgencies going on here. Fascinating. And it's again, the British face this. We're facing, although the Taliban have come along, but you still have various tribes who are fighting against the UN, or the American and its allies, NATO, more specifically. This is what these tribesmen did to the British. What's changed here? Not really anything. They've maintained the continuity. But what's fascinating here is you have a Russian army technologically advanced up to this point over anyone else who's ever invaded this country, and they can't subdue it. The age-old ideas of revolt in this country still work. And what's fascinating, sure, you had in the beginning of the insurgency, you had some guys with AK-47s. You had a number of guys still using bolt-action Lee Enfield 303s from World War II, the old British Army rifle. In fact, there are reports some of these guys were using muskets. Enter the CIA. Obviously here, Brzezinski, like he says, wants to get the Russians stuck into Vietnam. So what's the CIA going to do? Supposedly support these guys, right? Okay, well they have bank accounts in Swiss banks. And what they're going to do is they're going to take some of the money in these Swiss bank accounts and they're going to buy Russian weapons. And they're going to buy them from the Russians and the Chinese, and the Egyptians and the Chinese. Why? Because they had Russian weapons. They had Russian weapons. Of course, the Egyptians don't get along with the Russians too well anymore by '79, and neither the Chinese. I mean, Moscow and Peking have been doing this for years. And they're only too happy to sell these weapons. So they're going to get AK-47s, the Afghans are. And RPG-7, rocket-propelled grenades, which is going to be one of the greatest weapons they'll get. But that's not good enough. You know, the CIA idea here is, well, let's arm them just to keep this thing going and wear out the Soviets. Sounds like a plan. Sounds like a plan. But then you get people like Charlie Wilson. Remember him? Charlie Wilson in the war? Oh, no, that's not good enough. We need to give them like Stinger missiles, the European blowpipe missile, and then the CIA. There are elements in the CIA. Whoa, hold on here. Hold on here. How are you going to arm these people? You know, these people are traitors. These people are drug runners. Some of these people, now, they'll sell their souls for money. Where do you think some of these stingers are going to wind up? Do you think they're all going to be used in Afghanistan? Some of them were sold to the Revolutionary Guard in Iran for hard currency. Some are going to wind up in the Soviet Union. Some are going to wind up in the Middle East. Some are going to wind up in the Balkans in the 90s. Interesting where some of there's upwards of 1,000 of these things were supposedly earmarked for Afghanistan. And not all of them are going to be used in Afghanistan. This was what the CIA, elements in the CIA were not in favor of. They obviously knew what was going to happen here. They obviously knew. But did they make a difference here? Yes. Again, though, understand one thing about an insurgency. You know, insurgencies are not only technology against peasants. It's the will. It's the resolve. Do you have the stomach to keep this up for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? People in the West don't like this. They don't like this. And the track record is there for everyone to see. We lose in Vietnam? What happened by 67, 68? What were people here doing as a backlash to the war in Vietnam? What were people doing by 1948, 49 in France in response to Vietnam? What are some people doing here now in this country in response to Iraq and Afghanistan? Yeah. These people in the West don't like long wars. Yeah, they love the Persian Gulf War. It was over in 96 hours. What's not to like about that war, right? What's not to like about that war? Only cost you 148 dead. Well, let's understand one thing, though. 1/4 of those 148 dead were friendly fire incidents. You know, even with people using millions of dollars worth of equipment and highly trained, people make mistakes. And in that game called war, sometimes mistakes are made. What happens? People die. Well, you learn for the next round. You know, in foreign policy, human life is cheap. Well, I think I don't have to tell you that. And this is another lesson to come out of Afghanistan. The Russians had the technological advantage. But what's interesting here is, with with these roads, these horrible roads, and the Russians using again, like the UN in Korea, 1950, 1951, tied to the roads because they're mechanized. The Afghans are not. They're moving by foot in the mountains, just like the Chinese in North Korea in the winter of 1950. You want to know something? What's interesting? In that cold winter in North Korea in 1950-51, you know some of the Chinese troops were wearing canvas sneakers? What do you think some of their toes look like? You can imagine that, huh? It goes down 10 below, 20 below, 30 below, that wind coming out of Manchuria going down that Korean peninsula. Brother, you'll freeze your tonsils. Ask GIs and Marines who were in Korea in the winter of 1950-51. They'll tell you. Brother, you'll freeze your tonsils. Well, the same sort of thing can happen in Afghanistan. And they have their cold season. In fact, now that you're getting into the warm weather months, the Taliban have started. They started another offensive here. Now, you do have your offensive, defensive seasons per the weather, depending on where you are. But the Russians were tied to these roads. Now, since they took various cities, you link these cities with these convoys. Well, what do you think the Afghan guerrillas are doing here? Hiding in certain areas in the mountains, waiting for the convoys to go by? Interesting, they would hit the middle of the convoy or the end. If the territory deemed it necessary, they would hit the convoy in the beginning, and now with burning vehicles, now the road's blocked. Enter the helicopter. Good thing, the helicopter. You know, helicopter enables troops to fight like guerrillas. You can drop them behind the enemy lines, pick them up, move them out. The enemy's front is his rear, the enemy's rear is his front. From Mao Zedong, that's the essence of the guerrilla. Mobility. You don't fight anybody if they outnumber you or you have equal numbers. You fight them when you have the advantage in numbers, perhaps. And then retreat. This is the idea of the guerrilla. Hit and run, or like the Marines say, shoot and scoop. Same sort of thing. However, understand the Russians here. And it was proved in Vietnam, it's proved here, and I'm going to tell you something, it was probably proved in Iraq. If you're invading a country and fighting an insurgency, you really can't expect to succeed, even with the high-tech equipment and communications. Don't expect to succeed if you're using conscripts, volunteers, and reservists. The people you want to fight guerrillas are special forces, airborne types, professional troops who are going to make a career out of this. Not a National Guardsman who leaves his job for a year, stays in wherever you put him, comes back, goes back to work, leaves that job, goes back to Iraq, comes back. You know what I'm saying here? There's no continuity here. What are these guys getting out of, what are these guys and gals getting out of this? They're reservists. They're not real professional troops. These are the type of people you need to fight guerrillas, professional troops, and this is what the Russians were doing too. Volunteers, conscripts, reservists. Of course, with the Russians, Russian troops were in Afghanistan for 15 to 18 months. Officers were there for 2 years. And as this went on, and morale began to do this, drinking, selling weapons to raise money, and the Russian government, Moscow, was not telling many of the people what was going on here. And many of these troops in the beginning thought they were here liberating a people from Western imperialism. And when they get there, they find out that's not the case. Moscow trumpeted the idea. Remember the Russian army in World War II, the vaunted Red Army. The vaunted Red Army which actually wins the land war in what you call the Second World War. They win it, we don't. They do 90% of the fighting against the German army and 90% of the dying. This was an army that would lose 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times what the Germans would lose to win. That's not the army that's in Afghanistan. One of the reasons for this is the Russians were defending in World War II. Now they're the offending team. It is the Mujahideen who are the defenders. They have something to fight for. What is the Russian fighting for near Bagram? What's he getting out of this? She's shaking her head. Well, what's an American kid getting in the Euphrates River? What's he getting out of this? Interesting. The same mistakes are made over and over and over again. And one of the things that's going to come out of this Afghan war is, yes, it's who has the resolve to win a guerrilla war. That's what this is. We can see this with our own revolution, which was a civil war. And what's fascinating here is there's more in common with the Afghan uprising of all these various tribes and ethnicities forming these different mujahideen with our revolution than there is in Vietnam. Why? Because if you look at the 13 colonies, with the uprising of the, keep in mind, there was an uprising there was an American insurgency. And they not only indulged in guerrilla tactics, but terrorism as well. But it was not unified. You had these people in the 13, it's fascinating, 13 colonies rising up spontaneously. And it's fascinating to see when you really begin to rip this apart. Patriots against Tories. That's part of the American Revolution. Civil War. That's really our first Civil War. Because when that war is over with, you know, if there's 100,000 people are going to leave this country, I don't want to live here. They don't want to live here. They want to stay with the crown. So before you really talk about the American Revolution, it's a civil war, but it's spontaneous. And what's interesting here is they begin to set up, and they did this in Connecticut, they set up these committees of safety or committees of public safety, taking out British appointed elected officials, not elected officials, British appointed officials, and inserting their own. That's revolution, all right. That's a revolution from the bottom up, not the top down. And that's the same sort of thing that's going to happen in Afghanistan. The same sort of thing. 1985, 1776, what the heck is the difference here? The geography? Yeah, that's different. And it's how we seem to forget these lessons here. That concept alone I find fascinating. Again, history does this. Repeat itself? Yeah. But again, the lesson that comes out of Afghanistan here is no matter how technologically advanced, no matter the superiority in communications, equipment, food, whatever else, unless the troops are fully committed morally, politically, religiously, ideologically, they're not going to win in this setting. The people in Afghanistan were committed. Now what's fascinating here is the Russians are going to lose 14,000 and change dead and have some 49,000 and change wounded out of a total of 642,000 who supposedly served here. But what's astounding here is a total out of 642,000 men, 469,000 total casualties. Overwhelmingly so by sickness and disease, meningitis, typhus, malaria, amoebic dysentery. That you heard about in the Pacific with the Marines and GIs beating the Japanese on Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tarawa, New Guinea, that hellhole. I once knew a guy, I think he's since passed, who used to fly a P-38 twin-engine Lightning, World War II. And he used to fly out of New Guinea. And he once told me, he says, Mark, this goes back about 15 years ago. I'm pretty sure he's going now. He was in his 80s then. And he said, Mark, he said, whenever I want to go live in New Guinea by choice, Mark should have his head examined. He says, when I was there for 8 months, and he says, I prayed I'd never go back to this place. No matter if it's rainy or sunny, you're wet because of the humidity. He said the corruption of the jungle it defies description. And he says, if you can, you change your socks because you knew what was going to happen to your feet. And he said, I don't know any other place in the world. I do not know any other place in the world. Remember the cans of Spam? I remember my father called me that. He had that World War II. That's why my mother, hey, we're not having Spam tonight for dinner. And I remember him saying, he says, Mark, you remember the little can with the key? You take the key off and you undo the top. And he says, you take the lid off, and the meat is it's like a little brick, if you want to call it that, surrounded in gelatin. He said, okay. He says, I know no other place in the world where we did not eat our Spam, we drank it. That's what the heat did. Heat and humidity did. He says, you couldn't tell the meat from the gelatin. That's what I want. That's where I want to go to have dinner. But he said it's dank, it's corrupt, the jungle. And he says, I couldn't wait to fly, to get out of that steam bath. But he says, when you get up and fly, he says, you're up at 15, 20,000 feet. You know, the P-38 did not have a pressurized interior. Now you can be chilly. And he says, we 10, 12 hours escorting B-24s over Japanese targets. And he says, now you want to come down and land. But then when you land, you want to go back up again. He says, It's amazing. And this is the sort of thing, and oh, trench foot, if you want to get a version of that, of the fungus that would affect these guys. I remember my wife's uncle, who has since passed, he was on Saipan, and ever since 1940, Al died, I guess, about 40 years ago. But Al said every summer from 1944 on, when it got to be August, he says, I get the fungus on my feet. And he said the VA gave me this cream and it would go away. But he said it must be in my system. Every year from 1944 till 2012 when Al died, every year, like you could have set your watch to this. Interesting. And this is what you see in Afghanistan. So out of 642,000 men, 412,000 and change were at one point sick with disease. All sorts of diseases. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that perhaps the Soviet army was not as advanced as it's supposed to have been. What happened to diet, hygiene, medicine? That never would have happened to an American army. Never. But at the same time, the side that wins loses up to 1.3 million dead. What does that tell you about these people? Bear any burden? Face any challenge? Yes. They're going to win. They're going to win. And this is where these jihadis get their guts. If we can help throw the Russians out, what can we do after this? Keep in mind, as I mentioned, 79 was a big year for Sunnis. Not only had the Russians invaded Afghanistan, a bunch of infidels invading a brother Muslim country, and Muslims coming from all over the Islamic world to go here to fight. All over the Islamic world. What's going to happen afterwards? Some of these guys are going to go back to Chechnya. Some of these guys are going to go back to the Balkans. Bosnia, Herzegovina. Remember that? In the 90s? Yeah. And where are some of these guys going to wind up again? Middle East. They got their guts here. If we can throw the Russians out, and what's interesting, we never talk about that in this country. How important this was. These people fought the last big battle of what you, at that point, was the Cold War. The post-World War II end of the Cold War. They're the ones on the ground that defeat the Russians. Of course, after it's over with, what do you think the Lithuanians are saying to themselves? Gee, if these people can do it, what do you think the Latvians, the Estonians, the Poles, the East Germans, the Hungarians, the Czechs? What do you think they're all saying? Boy, if these people can do it, and what's going to happen to the Soviet Union by 1990? Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Couldn't put it back together again. Has Russia transformed? Yes. Many of these people are so-called communists. I'd rather tell you the capitalism. Many of them are still there. Mr. Putin? KGB, FSB, so on and so forth. But now what you see coming out of Afghanistan is what you see now, followed by al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda comes out of Afghanistan. But now you have Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. The Islamic State. The Islamic State is an advance here. Al-Qaeda at one point was just a terrorist group. Now you see the Islamic State, a so-called terrorist group, but implementing a state. It's almost as if the jihadis saved Afghanistan. Now they're taking the next step in eliminating borders drawn by the West in the Middle East and forming this thing called an Islamic State. It's fascinating progression to see. It really is. But again, when we get into this, the next talk is May 9, by the way. It's not next week. But when we get into this on May 9th, it's almost like you've seen a so-called attempt by people who say they're religious, the Islamic State, kind of copying the Damascus Protocol of 1914